Yo, what's up guys? It's the new sensation, Big O Notation here, and today I have a very special video because today I'm going to be profiling the deck that I took to the European finals, and I'm going to be kind of breaking down my experience on the day and how my matchups went and things like that. So just to give you guys a bit of an advance on how this video is going to go, I'm going to go through my list of first, kind of break down some of my initial card choices and why I initially made the choices that I made with like different ratios and different tech choices and stuff going into the day. And then after that, I'll break down my matchups on the day and how I played best to beat the matchups that I was against, and just kind of how the day went for me. So you guys can get a little bit of a look into how the finals went for me, as well as how my deck was looking on the day. But as you can see, I took King Cold and I managed to pilot this to a 6 wins, 2 losses finish. So I ended up placing 19th, only losing out to top 16 because of tiebreakers, which was a real shame. I was obviously really upset about that because I was hoping to make it to top 16. But I think that this was a really good pick for the event, and I think that I generally played as well as I could in all of my matches, and I'm very happy with the list as of current. So I'll go into it as fast as I can. I'll try not to go into too many of the basic things for you guys, because I'm sure you're all very accustomed to how King Cold plays at this point. But we've got the King Cold leader and then obviously the King Cold field. So between these two, they have a bunch of permanents. You play this guy out at the start of the game. And between the two, it basically means that all of your fields that cost 2 actually cost 1 in your hand. And then you can have as many fields out onto the board as you want, but all of your field cards have unique. So if you already have a copy of a field card, you can't play the same one from your hand. And then when you play a field card from your hand that costs 2, you can take a life and draw a card on the front side. His Awaken is untapped 2. And then on the back side, he's got the same permanent. When you activate a field card, you can then draw a card. You can't take the life anymore. And then an activate battle once per turn, you send a field card off, and then he gains 10k power for the battle. So that's the leader, and then this field is kind of just giving you more permanents, which I've already gone through. The reason that I chose to play this deck is because I expected there to be a lot of aggro and a lot of Cell Surge in the event, because it was a best of 1 event, so they're both going to be very strong. And a lot of people were playing aggro to counter Cell Surge because people were expecting Cell Surge. King Cold does very well against aggro, and I've structured my build a little bit more to help deal with a wider spread of matchups. I thought initially that King Cold did well into Cell Surge, and it did seem like that in my first couple of days testing, but as I tested it more, it felt a lot more even, and it started to feel very dice rolly. Like whoever went first has a real advantage in that matchup, because if you go first in Cell Surge, you can get your Dark Broly Unison down before the King Cold players turn 3, and that means that they have Frieza Charismatic Villain live for your turn 3 plays, and your turn 3 plays is where you really start to put the pressure on with this deck, because you have Golden Frieza coming down, and you have a couple of other big hitters that you'll want to be bringing down around turn 3. And so it feels really dice rolly, that matchup, the more that I tested it. But I still feel like this was a good pick, and it also has an incredibly good matchup into control decks, especially blue decks. I was expecting there to be a lot more blue decks than there were, because I didn't face a single blue deck throughout the entire day. But continuing on with the list, for the field card lineup, we have 4 New Ruler. This is obviously like the best card in the deck. It starts your plays going. And then we also have 4 copies of Anticipated Onslaught. This is arguably the worst field card. It's definitely the worst field card to see multiple copies of. It's really nice to see early game just 1 copy, but as soon as you start drawing multiple copies of Anticipated Onslaught, it feels awful. And the reason being is because it doesn't have an effect when it is sent off from the field, so it doesn't gain you any advantage like the other field cards do when you use your leader effect on it. But when it sees another card get sacked off from your leader effect, then it will pop a 2 cost or less, which is nice. And also something to note is this is the only field card that doesn't let you take a life. So it means that it can oftentimes stagger your awakening a little bit, and also it will, if you're going for game and you want to be taking your own life because you need more cards in hand, this is not the field card to play if you have options to play other ones. A little bit different to some of the King Cold lists that I've seen. I'm running 3 Unstoppable Invasion. I've seen a lot of people cut this down to 2. There were a couple of reasons that I was running 3. So the first reason is in those really aggressive matchups, when you're against like Gogeta Zeno, Red Broly BR, which were the 2 main decks I was prepping for with this deck, or any sort of aggro deck, you want to be able to awaken turn 2 as consistently as possible. And something that I've been struggling with is if you're against an aggro deck and they don't swing into you on your turn 1, and you've played like anticipated odds, or you can't like get down to that 4 life breakpoint where you want to awaken, then it can get really tricky, because then you have to awaken on turn 3, and they'll often put pressure on you to try and force you awaken on their turn. If you end your turn 2 on or unawakened or on 5 or more life, then they're going to start pressuring you, and then you might have to awaken during their turn, which feels awful. But then the problem comes, so that kind of presents the issue of, okay, I want to take a lot of my life on turn 1 and turn 2, but then if they aggro me down too hard, it can, like, they'll put me to 2 or 3 life before I can awaken and start making plays. And so that makes the matchup a little bit more interesting than you might have originally thought. But the reason that I'm running 3 copies of this is because it lets you take a life, and it gives you an extra field card that you want to see turn 1 against aggro matchups, because you want to take your own life to make sure that you can awaken turn 2. So that was the reasoning behind that, and also because this card has very strong application against control matchups, especially against blue, who are playing the Majin Buu Unison, because it can give your leader double strike, so it can make your leader a 25k double strike swinger, and then when it's also sent off from one of your card effects, so your leader activate battle will be the most consistent one, it removes a marker from your opponent's Unison. So this card will come in really nicely against blue, because it can, combining it with your leader double strike swing, it will mean that you can take their Buu Unison down to 1 marker with just this 1 card. But it also comes up just against any slower matchup where Unisons are going to be really important, because of the just like constant advantage that a Unison will give you whilst it's on the board. So against matchups like Hatchiyak or blue decks or any sort of slow matchup, it really comes in nicely. The only problem that I found with this card was that if you send it off against the Cell Surge matchup and choose to remove a marker from their Unison, you're then going to be discarding a card because of the Dark Broly skill, which is really annoying to play against, because most of the time this deck can melt through Unisons and it doesn't have a problem with them, but the Dark Broly Unison is just awful to get through because you're discarding cards for it. And then the last field card I'm running is 2 Terrified Realization. This is basically just having an extra name. It's really nice because it lets you take a life and draw a card on play, so if you don't want to take a life, you're still drawing a card. But yeah, it will also help you self-awaken, just like the Unstoppable Invasion. And then if you have 4 or more field cards out, your Frieza Clan battle cards gain plus 5k, so this will just buff up like your Frieza counterplay to a 15k, it will buff up some of your other guys to 20k. And it just means that once you've built this board of counterplays and counterattacks that have been interacting with your opponent during their turn, it suddenly turns them into an actual threat during your next turn. And it's actually a really nice card to run. And then for the battle cards, so these are the anticipated onslaught targets that I'm running. I'm running 4 copies of Berry Blue, obviously. It's like the best card in the deck. It has an activate main every single turn that's just draw 8 for 1 energy. And it also has an on-play skill that will search you your Unison and all your field cards. I'm also running 2 copies of Paragus the Sacrifice. I think that this card is really strong in King Cold, and I definitely underrated it. I wasn't running this card originally, and then I put it in later in testing. It, again, really helps you with that blue matchup, or any of the control matchups that you might play against. But it's also just another card that you can then play off Anticipated Onslaught and gain a bit of advantage. For a couple of reasons. So obviously it can send off your field cards, and so in those aggressive matchups you can play this off Anticipated Onslaught if you don't see the Berry Blue, and then send off your other field cards and then trigger Anticipated Onslaught a lot more consistently whilst giving you a hand, and then Anticipated Onslaught will kill all of their small guys. But the main application for this is against the control matchups, because it means that you can send, if you have an Unstoppable Invasion on your board already, which is the double strike field card that removes a marker when it's sent off, you want to send it off of the board before you swing with your leader so that you can give your leader double strike to swing at a unison, right? But the only way outside of Paragus to get a field card off your board in this deck is with the leader's activate battle. So that means either you're swinging with your other battle cards, which again in the control matchups sometimes you don't have any other battle cards to properly swing with, or if you are swinging with battle cards, it means they get the chance to trigger the Majin Buu Unisons -1, and then you're wasting the 10k that you could get on the activate battle. So if it's a really big unison like Gohanks, that's going to be relevant. So this just gives you a way to kill off the Unstoppable Invasion before your leader swing, and then bring it back with Berry Blue off of the activate main, or just play it from your hand, and then give your leader double strike, swing with the leader, activate battle on the leader to sack it off again, and that's a way to remove 4 markers for 1 energy in total off of any unison that you want. So that's the main reasoning behind running Paragus to Sacrifice. But like I said, I didn't play against a blue matchup all day, which was a bit of a shame because I was kind of hoping to play against it. And then for the unison lineup, we're obviously running the 4 King Vegeta. This is just the unison that you run in this deck. It lets you play a field card every turn from your hand for free, and it also threatens a triple striker once you start hitting that late game point. Most good players are not going to let you get to the 4 marker point, or even the 3 marker point where you can slide another copy under and get to the triple strike. I don't think I used this to end a game at all. No, I used it to end a game once actually, but the triple strike wasn't even relevant in that game because my opponent was already on 1 life. But the card is still really good, and it's definitely the unison to run. And then, because we're running a green unison, we run 3 copies of Frieza Charismatic Villain. That's pretty standard. We're also playing a control deck, so we want to control the board. We're also running 3 copies of the Cooler Effortless Strike. I think that this card is really good in this deck, especially in a best of 1 format. Because in best of 1, first of all, you're going to see a lot of aggro, and second of all, you're going to see a lot of rogue picks. And Cooler is an amazing card in shutting down both those strategies. Because oftentimes rogue picks will just have, well, aggro picks will have a lot of low to the ground stuff which you can then counterplay. In any sort of control matchup, you can just counterplay something irrelevant, even if it's just a cantrip, or even if it doesn't cost 4 or less, you counterplay it, and then sometimes you'll get the discard out and you just get the body down. I think that this card is really good, and I don't see a lot of King Cold lists running the Cooler, but I think that especially in a best of 1 format, it's really underrated. In best of 3, I can definitely see myself just siding the card instead, or maybe siding like 1 copy and maining 2 copies instead. But because in some matchups it feels like a completely useless card, like against Cell Surge, it is not that relevant apart from when you're trying to kill the surprise attack Freezer or the Overwhelm. But yeah, it's very good in the matchups where it's good, and it doesn't feel great in the matchups where it's bad. So it could be more of a side deck card in a best of 3 format, but in best of 1 it really shines. For the Negate lineup, we're running 4 Royal Supremacy. Obviously, this is basically the best card in the deck. This just wins you the game against Gogeta Zeno, because it means they can't swarm their board with 1-drops for fear of getting negated and just having their entire board popped. Oh, another reason why I was running Cooler Effortless Strike in the main deck was because I was expecting a lot of Red Broly, and Red Broly gets completely ruined by this card. Because it means that they have to invest energy into their swaps before being able to actually establish a chain, because you can just keep counterplaying them when they're about to go into a 4-drop. And even if they use the whole window thing where the card stays in their hand because they didn't actually declare that they were playing it at that point, it's still definitely worth it, because by that time they have to invest 2 energy into it, 1 for the 3-drop swap and 1 for playing the 1-drop. And 2 energy in Red Broly is obviously quite a lot because it's an aggressive deck. So this card just completely shuts down the Red Broly matchup for you. It's really nice. And then for some of my other negates, I'm running 2 Homicidal Clones and 2 King Cold Supreme Ruler. So this package I've thought about a lot. I've been thinking about upping Homicidal Clones to 3. I've also thought about upping King Cold to 3. And I just went with a 2-2 split because I found myself not really playing more than 1 Homicidal Clones in a game. Sometimes I would play 2, but a lot of the time it would just be the 1 that I needed because I wanted to get myself to 3 life. or I could just use it to defend a unison at the time where it was most important. The King Cold Negate was really strong, and I think it's massively underrated for this deck, especially for this particular format. So like I've mentioned before, I was expecting a lot of aggro and a lot of Cell Surge, and aggro obviously wants to hit your leader. The main weakness of the King Cold Negate is that it only stops attacks on the leader. So they can just turn around and start hitting your unison down, obviously, and that is a lot harder to defend. But the reason that I was running this card is because aggro doesn't really want to turn around and start hitting your unison. I mean, obviously they can, and they would when I played this card, because they don't want to swing into my leader with such a small hand, because aggro decks always have a relatively small hand. So they would just swing into my unison, and that's fair enough, but I'm saving myself an extra turn with this card almost every time that I drop it. But it's also giving me a 15k body that can be buffed up to 20k with the Terrified Realization field card. And then in the Cell Surge matchup, this just acts as another body. Like, I can negate an attack if they swing with their... especially if they're swinging to my unison. It's just very useful to have a hard negate that's going to give me a body as well. And the main argument that I had for this card was whether I take it out for an extra copy of Homicidal Clones or if I take it out for Dormants. And I think that this card is better than Dormant in the particular format that I was in, because it was best of one and it was heavily Cell Surge and aggro, or that's what I was preparing for anyway. And against Cell Surge, Dormant is a completely useless card, so this is going to be better in the Cell Surge matchup, because Dormant costs you 2 cards in hand. It doesn't give you a body, whereas this gives you a body and costs you 1 card in hand. And then in the aggro matchup, I think Dormant is probably better, but this still keeps you those cards in hand, and it still gives you the extra body. And because of the fact that I was running Royal Supremacies on top as well as Homicidal Clones, if I ever had this card alongside one of either of these cards against an aggro matchup, I knew I was safe to just drop this, and then if they start swinging my unison, I can just negate one of the attacks, and generally that's enough to keep my unison alive. Or at least to gain some advantage, or gain enough advantage off the Royal Supremacy pops or something like that. So King Cold just puts them in a really tough spot, and in my opinion it's better than Dormant in this deck. I don't think you necessarily need to run Dormant. And then again in those control matchups, it's another 20k body that you can play for 1 energy, or you can even free play it off Anticipated Onslaught if it gets to that kind of point. For the super combos, we're obviously running 4 Paragus. I think this is just standard. There's an argument a bit for running the Great Saiyaman super combo that bottom decks 1 and draws 2, but this card in my opinion is just better because you get to see the 2 cards before you warp a card, and that's really relevant especially in this deck because you have a lot of extra cards. I think this deck is something like 22 or 24 extra cards, so almost half the entire deck is extra cards. And so you want to check how many extra cards you're going to have in your hand before you choose to warp one. And then going into the more top end of the deck with the finishers and some of the tech choices, I'm running 2 Golden Freezer. I have at times considered upping this card to 3, and I think that in a slower format, or maybe even in the best of 1 format that I was in, this could have been at 3, because there weren't very many times where I missed it, but there were definitely times where I missed it, and I definitely felt the times where I missed it. So this card could honestly maybe go to 3. It's just the fact that it's so expensive for this deck because it's 3 energy. But it's obviously a really, really good card. It's like the best finisher in the deck. And the card is just insanely strong. For the rest of the deck, I think the rest of the deck is all one-offs. We have 1 Fused Zamasu. So this was again for that blue or slower control matchup. This card throughout the day felt like the weakest card in the deck, mostly because I didn't play against blue. I did play against a Hatchyak, and this card is really nice against Hatchyak, but the issue is a lot of Hatches are maining the Deborah Ritual at hand for the Cell Surge matchup, obviously. And so if you burn your only swing a turn into this guy and they drop a Deborah, it means that you can basically lose the game from that because you've just burnt an entire turn on this 1 card and they've just drawn 2 cards from it. The main utility of this card in the Hatch matchup is the fact that it's indestructible, so you can keep choosing it for the 8-drop Gogeta Zeno effect where you need to warp 2 battle cards. But that never ended up coming up. I don't think I even drew this in the hatch matchup. And then I guess the other utility of this card is you can swing when they're on really low energy and really low life. Because then if they drop Dabura, they don't want to necessarily tap out to draw 2, because that means they can't negate for the rest of the turn. So you can use that as a kind of an extra pressure tool. But this card was definitely the weakest card in the deck on the day. I think that it's still a necessary card in the deck just for like matchups, like the slower matchups, like the blue matchup, because it really shines in those matchups. I just didn't see many of those. Then I'm also running 1 copy of Sun Gohan Hidden Might. This was kind of another utility tech. So the idea behind this card is it's very easy to get to 3 life with this deck, because you can do it proactively on your turn by playing almost any of your field cards. But you can also do it during your opponent's turn, either by just taking damage, or if you need to defend your unison, you can homicidal clones kind of as a proactive negate in a way to get you to 3 life for your next turn. And this card is just a nice way to apply pressure, because it's going to be a 2-drop 25k double strike, but it also KOs a card on play, and it ignores barrier. So this is just a way to get rid of pesky cards like the 3-drop slug, which came up fairly often with this deck. There was also times where I was able to kill Kai secret rares, because people would greedily drop Kai secret rare during my turn to stop my unison and leader swing, and I could just go tap 2 and drop this so that you can't clear my board that I've established. And so people were doing that and being very greedy throughout the day. I think I managed to do that twice on a few people. So it's definitely worth running, and I think this card is really good in the deck. It also just removes pesky things like blockers. I managed to kill a Sin secret rare, the 8-drop Sin Xeno card that's considered yellow and black. I managed to kill that with this. So this card, it comes up a fair amount, and you would think that because you already have barrier removal in the deck with the Golden Freezer, that this card isn't as useful, but just the fact that it's 2 energy versus the Golden Freezer's 3 is what makes it so good. And because it's an on-play effect, so it can't get negated by the by things like the Sin 9-drop that negates skills when you play cards. I would consider taking this card out for the Golden Freezer, for the 3rd copy that I was talking about, but I don't think that the format is slow enough to warrant that, really. And then for the last cards, we're running the Kibito Kai secret rare. So this, in tandem with the King Cold negate, is my reasoning behind why I don't think you need Dormant in this deck anymore. I think that it was definitely a card you could run, and I think that it's still a card you can side deck, but I don't think you need Dormant in this deck, or at least in the main deck anymore. Just between this card and the King Cold negate, I think that those cards are just better to run in a best of 1 format where hand control is a thing. This was going into the tournament. This was my win condition for Cell Surge, because I was thinking you can just drop this as a 40k double striker, steal their Dark Broly unison, and try and pressure them with those 2, because that's a lot of double strikes to deal with, especially if you can give your leader double strike with Unstoppable Invasion as well. But it's also just an amazing card against almost any matchup. You're going to be... Like, the power in this card is so insane because of the fact that it's good in both aggressive and control matchups. Because against aggro matchups, the activate battle part, where you can stop all of their battle card swings for the turn, is obviously insane. It's like a baby hatch for green. And then you can also steal their unison if they have one, but oftentimes against aggro, you're not stealing their unison. But against control matchups, when they have a really high advantage unison like Gohanks, or like the Majin Buu unison, or even against Hatch, if they're just drawing a lot of cards off of their Bardock unison, you can just slap this guy down and take it, and it feels really amazing. I think that this card is definitely the secret rare you want to run in King Cold. I don't think the other green secret rares really hold a candle to Kibito Kai anymore. And then for the last 2 cards in the deck, I was running Fighting Against Fate as my overrealm of choice, along with a Kai. So I've kind of gone really back and forth with this package. It feels really good when it goes off, and especially in a best of 1 format, this is going to take a lot of people by surprise and just be a really solid finisher. But I think that I would maybe consider cutting... I'd consider cutting one of them going forward. I'm not sure which one. I'd probably consider cutting the Kai, because the Fighting Against Fate feels fine on its own. Like, it's even on its own, it's a free 25k dual attack swing. But if you just have Kai and you don't see the fighting against Fate, this Kai feels really useless a lot of the time. And it's also not a card you can charge, which is a pain because this deck needs to be green energy all the way. But the main issue with this card is that your leader can already gain double strike off of the field card. And so when you're pushing for game, you want to be doing that. If not for the double strike, then for the extra 10k it will give your leader. And then most of your finishers are going to be double strike, like your Secret Rare's double strike, your Golden Freezer's double strike, your Gohan is double strike. So this card just doesn't really come up all that much, and then your Unison can gain triple strike. So oftentimes in the late game, they're just negating your Unison swing. And then you swing with a bunch of double strikes, and then this sits in your hand and feels really useless if you don't have Bardock. And another issue with this is obviously neither of these are searchable off of New Ruler, and because this deck only uses Berry Blue to shuffle the deck, if you bottom deck one of these off of New Ruler, then it feels awful. Especially if you bottom deck the Bardock and you have a Kai sat in hand, because then Kai feels almost completely worthless for the rest of the game. So before I get into matchup spread for the day, I just want to mention maybe a couple of things. I think it will probably just be one thing, but if you're playing New Ruler, you want to be really cautious with how many cards you see. So I was just talking about how neither of these two cards are searchable off of New Ruler, and so if they get bottom decked, it feels awful because they're like a second Secret Rare together. The thing with New Ruler is you can look up to 3 cards, so you want to be taking them one by one, right? You want to be checking them as you go. And if you see a super combo or your Secret Rare or any card that you might need in the situation that you're in, you want to be just taking that card. If you're in a fairly flexible spot, then unless you see a super combo or your Secret Rare, you can keep just checking the cards until you find a specific card that you need, or just a card that you don't have currently, to depreciate diminishing returns. But if you see a super combo or your Secret Rare, you want to just take it immediately, because then if you see 2 of those in your top 3, if you see, say, 2 super combos or a super combo and your Secret Rare, then one of those is getting bottom decked, and it might be for the rest of the game. So you want to be really careful when doing that. And also, the fewer times that you look at 3 cards with this, the less chances there are of you bottom decking your Bardock and your Kai. And that's just really something very important to note with this deck. And I think that it's definitely underappreciated when playing King Cold, is just checking as few cards as you can and knowing your situation and your deck well enough to know which cards you should be grabbing at any which point. So to go through my matchups for the day, round 1 I had a bye, so obviously because I won the Card Market Regional back in March, I came first place. Part of that prizing group was that I got a bye for the European Finals, so I got a bye for this round. Round 2 I was against Red Broly BR, and I cannot quite express how happy I was to see that deck popping up, because I had predicted that Red Broly BR would be popping up as a meta call, as a counter to Cell Surge in particular, and that was part of my reason behind deciding to go for the King Cold deck. So I managed to keep him off of he didn't get a 4-drop onto the board for the entire game. I was just able to keep him off of the 4-drop so he could never go up his chain into the impactful pieces. And then I was just able to control the board and manage to win the game. So that matchup was a win. Then round 3 I played against Cell Surge, and I had a pretty rough loss, so I lost the dice roll. I think I only won the dice roll once throughout the entire day. I lost the dice roll, and then he hit my Secret Rare out of my hand when I had 11 cards in hand, and then I went into a turn with 5 cards in hand, and I had 2 copies of Berry Blue in hand, so I was like, I'll charge one of them because the rest of my hand is fairly okay, and I felt like I needed the rest of the cards. And then I swung, and he sells Kamehameha again, and he ripped the Berry Blue out, which was the main card I needed at that point to start refilling my hand, obviously. And then when he was swinging for game, he used his leader effect, and I had 2 cards in hand, and he ripped the super combo out. I can't remember what the other card was, but it was pretty irrelevant. So he had some very lucky hits out of my hand, Because like I mentioned previously when talking about the secret rare, the Kibito Kai secret rare going second really feels like your win condition because it's your main comeback tool with this deck. And so against Cell Surge, I was just really hoping to establish that Kibito Kai secret rare. And as soon as I searched it, I then swung. I think I passed turn and he swung and just Cell's Kamehameha'd it out my hand. Which felt obviously really bad considering I'd lost the dice roll and then he hit perfectly out of my hand for the game. But that was fine. I think that the matchup is not amazing for King Cold. The more that I play it, it feels more and more hard to play. But I think that it's fairly close to 50-50. I think that it's maybe like 60-40 or 55-45. I think that game I just got particularly unlucky. So I lost that game. Round 4 I played against Gogeta Zeno and I was very happy to again see aggro. So going into these matchups against all of the decks that I've played against, I wanted to be Awakening by turn 2 because I wanted to make sure that I had my counterplays live. So the main play against aggro is to play, and I think the main play against Cell Surge as well, because it gets your hand up the most efficiently, or at least going second it does. The main play is to play a field turn 1 and take 2 life off of your leader effect and then off the field effect. And then on turn 2 you tap 2 for your unison, you play a field out, you take as many life as you can to get down to 4. If they haven't attacked you, you take 2 life, but if they have attacked you, you just go down to 4. And then you can awaken, you can then either, if you have Berry Blue out, if you played an anticipated onslaught, you can swing with leader to stack off one of your fields and then tap 1 for Berry Blue to bring it back. Because the main important thing to note is you want to get your leader's backside auto to get the extra draw as well as your leader's frontside auto. So after you've awakened, you've got that 2 energy up, you want to use one of those for a field card, whether it's playing one from your hand or if it's just swinging with leader to use the activate battle and get it off the board to then replay it from a Berry Blue you might have. And then going into those aggressive matchups, you want to leave 1 energy open because you want to have either Cooler Counterplay live or King Cold Negate live. And so that's what I did against Red Broly BR and against Gogeta Zeno, and that's how I won those matchups fairly easily. I think the Gogeta Zeno matchup was actually fairly close because I think I only won by like 5 or 10k combo. He was really close to being able to out combo my kill swing. Against Cell Surge, if you're going first, you want to try and awaken on turn 3, and there's a play that you do to try and awaken on turn 3 against the control matchups, which I'll get into now. Because my round 5 was against Hatchiyak, and this is where you definitely want to awaken turn 3 if you can. This was my only dice roll win all day, I'm pretty sure. But the dice roll win against Hatchiyak felt very impactful because I'd been testing it with Scrub Games the day before because he's been playing a lot of Hatch recently. And the dice roll feels very impactful because it means I can get my unison established and threaten to play a golden freezer on turn 3 the turn after he can play his unison. So if he plays his unison on turn 2, I can then just swing either with my leader with double strike from an unstoppable invasion or with a golden freezer into it. And if he's tapping out for the unison, so the main interaction between the King Cold matchup and the Hatch matchup is worrying about the Kai negate, because if you swing to, if you don't order your swings right and you swing with, and you have golden freezer on the board and it gets Kai negated and then warped off the board for the turn, you're gonna lose the ability to take cards out of their hand with the activate main. So it's really important not to get greedy and to swing first with the golden freezer. You want to just play it, use the activate main, and then swing, so that you guarantee you get the activate main off, so you get the card advantage. But because I went first, he wasn't able to drop his unison on turn 2, which meant he wasn't able to get the draw power because he had to keep energy open for negates. And then I made sure to swing with my leader and my unison before dropping the golden freezer, so that he could potentially mess up and play some negates down on those 2 swings before I showed him that I had the golden freezer, so that he couldn't Kai it. And he ended up negating my leader attack and my unison attack, which meant he was tapped out, and then I could drop golden freezer and then get really greedy and swing twice with the golden freezer, so that I could get 2 double strike swings through. And that put him to 2 life on turn 2. So from then on, or on turn 3, sorry, it was my turn 3, his turn 2. From then on, I went on to go for a kill swing, and I did all of my stuff, swung with a double strike leader, all of that. I comboed all in, or as all in as I could, because I had some 10Ks in hand, and he comboed out with 4 remaining cards in his hand, and I don't think he had anything on board, or he might have had the 6-drop King Vegeta. And then I dropped the Kibito Kai SCR, because obviously it's an 8-drop, so it gets over the hatch permanent. And I swung with that to try and push for game, but he, even though he was tapped out, he had the Sparking 5 life for Power Burst, so he went down to 1 life. Then we got into a really simplified game state, because he dropped Kai SCR on me and wiped my board and my Unison off board. So we just basically passed back and forth for a little bit, where I was just swinging and trying to burn through all of his negates, so that I could get through his last life. But I was at a point where I was keeping a Unison in my hand for like 4 or 5 turns straight, because obviously the hatch permanent only affects battle cards, it's not going to affect my Unison, so I can just drop, even if I have a Unison down, if I swing with it and then drop another Unison down over it, that'll just give me an extra swing. And honestly, at that point, all I needed was extra swings, because he was going to start taking over the game, because he was getting to the late game. But he was under so much pressure, and he had so few cards in hand, that he either wasn't able to see a Gogeta as an 8-drop Gogeta, or he wasn't able to drop it because I was applying so much pressure throughout the game. So he just kept on negating all of my attacks, and eventually I tapped 6 for my Unison, and then went in with the triple strike just to get the extra 5Ks that I could off of the fields that I had out, and that was game, even though I had no other cards in hand at that point. So I managed to win that match, which was a very fun match, honestly. Round 6, I was against Icarus Blue-Yellow. So my opponent was playing the Gohan Icarus leader, which received some fairly big hits, especially the Blue-Yellow stuff recently, but he was still on it and he was doing very well. I think at this point we were both on table 4, and I think that deck is definitely not dead. But I don't think his matchup was very good into King Cold, because throughout the entire game he had 16 cards in hand, but he was just not playing any cards, because I was keeping energy open for cooler counterplay. I had my freezer counterplay live, so either he had no plays in 16 cards just because he'd drawn poorly, or he was just trying to play around all of the stuff that I could have, which would probably make a bit more sense. And so I was able to take that game fairly comfortably, just by establishing a board, getting down the golden freezer, and swinging with a bunch of double strikes, just making sure to pressure him as much as I could throughout the game. Round 7, I was against Yellow Sin, and this was a more aggressive Sin list, but it did have a 9-drop and 1-star ball package in as well. So I was expecting it to be control, so I mulliganed for control, and that was I think my main mistake in that matchup. But I also got some really poor draws throughout the game. I managed to stall him out with the Kibito Kai SCR and stop his whole kill turn pretty well. And I was also controlling the board very well, because I had cooler counterplays and I had freezer counterplays, and those are incredibly good against the Sin matchups, because it means they're only ever going to be able to establish their 8-drops down. But I didn't see a single super combo throughout the entire game, and I also didn't see a single copy of New Ruler throughout the entire game, which was pretty impressive. And I went in for a kill swing. I went in for a massive kill turn, and he had 4 cards in hand at this point, and he used Power of a Super Saiyan to rest my Kibito Kai Secret Rare, and then drew a card. And then he used Haze Shenron to discard a card and kill my 5-drop Gohan double strike that I was first swinging with. And then I swung with Leader Swing, which had gained... I then comboed in the Kibito Kai to gain... or the Supreme Kai to gain double strike. Because at this point he was on 2 life. And with... I think he had 2 cards in hand this point. He managed to chain draw all 4 super combos when I'd gone throughout the entire game without seeing a single one. So I was pretty upset about that, because he had drawn extremely well in that last turn. And then he killed me on the clapback, so I ended up 5-2 at that point, and then round 8 I was against Helku, which was a really nice match. We were both very relaxed because we were both fairly rogue decks, just kind of somehow made it to top spots on the higher tables. So it was a nice game. I managed to win that as well because I was just able to control his board with the cooler counterplay, freezer counterplay. The thing is with Helku is most of their stuff is really, really low costed. I think their biggest guy is a 4-drop double striker. And so he's going to get coolered every single time he comes into play. And that's the thing with this deck, like I mentioned earlier, it's really good at dealing with rogue picks, and it's really good with dealing with aggro picks, and Helku is a perfect combination of both of those for me. So that was kind of my breakdown for the day. I ended up going 6-2, and I hope that some of that was helpful for if you guys play against any sort of similar matchups. But I managed, like I said earlier, I managed to pilot this to a 19th finish, just missing out on top 16 sadly. I think that this list is still fine. There were maybe a couple of changes that I would make that I think I've mentioned during the video. But for a best of one format, this is, I think, that one of the better lists that I could come up with. And I was very happy with it throughout the day. It performed very, very well. So I hope you guys enjoyed the deck profile, and maybe I'll get some gameplay up of this deck at some point. I would like to keep playing King Cold. I just don't own most of the expensive cards, like the few Zamasu I borrowed off of a mate, and then Kibito Kai the Kibito Kai Secret Rare I borrowed off of another mate. Shout out to Luke Jackson for lending me that and sending it through the post for me. That was really great. I appreciate it a lot. But I would like to continue playing this deck. I think that it's really strong going into next format, and it's going to be strong for a fair amount of time. I just don't own all of the cards quite yet, but if I can get all of the pieces together and I don't have to keep borrowing stuff, then maybe I'll keep playing it and maybe I can get some gameplays. So let me know down below if you'd be interested in some more gameplays. I think I had a game up against AOD, which I really enjoyed with this deck, because I think this deck has a lot of different playlines that you can kind of break down during a commentary, which is something I really enjoyed doing. So let me know if you're interested in any of that, and if you want to check out the gameplay that I just mentioned, I'll have it in the description below. Thank you guys very much for watching and supporting me as always, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.